In today's world, when people hear the name of the United States, they imagine power, freedom, and democracy. A nation built on the idea that the people are in control. A country where every voice matters, and every vote shapes the future. But what if that image is only part of the truth? What if the real system is far more complex and far less visible? This is not a conspiracy theory. This is a deeper look into how power actually works in modern America, a system where decisions are not always as simple as they appear, and where influence often operates behind the scenes. Every 4 years, millions of people participate in elections. Leaders change. Campaigns promise change. New faces enter the spotlight. But if you look closely, something unusual begins to stand out. The system itself rarely changes. Wars continue. Economic structures remain the same. Large corporations grow even more powerful. And for many ordinary citizens, life does not dramatically improve. So the question is, if leadership changes, why doesn't the system change with it? To understand this, we first need to understand what power really means. Power is not just about holding a position in government. Real power is the ability to influence outcomes, to shape economic policies, control military decisions, and guide public opinion. Whoever controls these 3 areas holds the true power. And this is where things begin to get interesting. Because when we look beyond the surface, we begin to see that power in modern America is not concentrated in a single place. It is spread across a network, a system where government institutions, corporations, media, and military forces are all connected. On the outside, it looks like a democracy. But underneath, it functions like a complex structure of influence. History gives us an important clue. From the very beginning, the foundations of the American system were shaped by individuals who were wealthy, educated, and deeply invested in protecting their interests. Their goal was not just to create a functioning government, but to create a stable system that could maintain control over time. As America evolved, so did this structure. Today, elections still exist. But running a successful campaign requires enormous financial resources. Billions of dollars are spent on advertising, media exposure, and public outreach, and most of that funding does not come from ordinary citizens. It comes from powerful donors, corporations, and organized interest groups. This raises an important question. If a system depends on funding from powerful entities, can it remain completely independent from them? Imagine a politician trying to win an election. They need visibility, marketing, and media presence. All of that requires money. Large donors provide that support. Now ask yourself, once that politician is in power, how easy is it for them to go against the interests of those who helped them get there? This is how influence works. Not always direct, not always visible, but deeply embedded in the structure itself. Over time, this creates a system where decisions are shaped in ways that avoid conflict with powerful interests. And slowly, the voice of the average citizen becomes just one part of a much larger equation. But government is only one part of this system, because in modern America, there are other forces that hold enormous influence. Corporations that control, industries, media organizations that shape perception, and military structures that define global strategy. Together, these elements form what we call the modern power system, a system that does not always reveal itself openly, but influences almost everything. And perhaps the most powerful part of this system is perception, because when people believe they are in control, they rarely question the structure around them. In this documentary, we will break down this system, layer by layer. We will explore how power flows through corporations, how media shapes reality, and how decisions are influenced at the highest levels. And by the end, we will attempt to answer one simple but powerful question. Is the United States truly a system of freedom, or is it a carefully structured network of control? When we talk about power in the United States, the official structure seems clear. Power is divided into 3 branches: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. The president enforces the law, Congress creates it, and the Supreme Court interprets it. This system is known as checks and balances, designed to prevent any single branch from becoming too powerful. On paper, it is one of the most carefully designed democratic systems in the world. But reality is often more complex than theory. Because while this structure defines how power is supposed to work, it does not fully explain how power actually operates in practice. At first glance, democracy appears to function as expected. Citizens vote. Leaders are elected. Policies are debated and passed. But beneath this visible process lies another layer, a network of influence that shapes decisions long before they reach the public stage. One of the most important elements of this hidden layer is lobbying. In the United States, lobbying is legal. Corporations, organizations, and interest groups are allowed to directly communicate with lawmakers to promote their interests. On the surface, this may seem like a normal part of a democratic system, giving different groups a voice in policymaking. But the reality is not always balanced, because not all voices carry the same weight. Large corporations and powerful interest groups have access to significant financial resources. They can hire experienced lobbyists, fund detailed research, and maintain constant communication with decision-makers. This gives them a level of access and influence that ordinary citizens simply do not have. And influence in this system does not always need to be direct. It often works through pressure, relationships, and long-term support. Another key factor is campaign financing. Running for political office in modern America is extremely expensive. From advertising and travel to media campaigns and staff, the cost of an election can reach hundreds of millions, even billions of dollars, and this funding has to come from somewhere. While small donations from citizens do play a role, a large portion of campaign funding comes from wealthy donors, political action committees, and corporate-backed groups. This creates a dependency, because when a political career relies on continuous funding, maintaining strong relationships with major donors becomes essential. And over time, this can shape priorities, not through direct orders, but through alignment of interests. Then there is what experts call the revolving door. This is a system where individuals move between roles in government and positions in private industry. A person may serve as a regulator, overseeing a specific sector, and later join a company within that same sector. Years later, they may return to government again. This constant movement creates deep connections between public institutions and private interests, and it raises an important question. Can a system remain fully neutral when the same individuals operate on both sides of the decision-making process? Another layer of complexity comes from the nature of modern policymaking. Today's laws are often highly technical and complex. They involve detailed economic models, legal language, and specialized knowledge. As a result, lawmakers rely heavily on advisors, consultants, and subject matter experts. But these experts are not always independent. In many cases, they are connected to industries that benefit directly from the policies being created. This means that influence can be built into the structure of the law itself, not visible, but deeply embedded. And then there is the role of bureaucracy. Within the government, there are permanent institutions and career officials who remain in place regardless of political changes. While elected leaders come and go, these structures continue to operate with long-term consistency. This provides stability, but it also means that real change can be slow and difficult. Even when leadership changes, the core system often remains the same. So when we ask who really holds power, the answer becomes more complicated. It is not just elected officials. It is a system, a network, where influence flows through funding, relationships, and institutional structures. Some argue that this system is necessary, that it allows for stability, expertise, and efficient decision-making in a complex modern world. Others argue that it creates imbalance, that it weakens the voice of ordinary citizens and concentrates power in the hands of a few. But regardless of perspective, one thing is clear. Power in modern America does not exist in a single place. It exists in layers, and to truly understand it, we must look beyond the surface. Because what we see is only the visible structure. What we do not see is where influence truly operates. And as we move forward, we begin to explore one of the most powerful forces within this system. A force that does not just influence decisions, but shapes the entire economic foundation of the country: corporations. If government represents visible power, then corporations represent invisible power, the kind that does not always appear in headlines, but quietly shapes the direction of entire nations. In modern America, corporations are no longer just businesses. They are institutions of influence, entities with the ability to impact economies, guide political decisions, and shape the everyday lives of millions of people. Over time, corporations have grown larger, more connected, and more powerful than ever before. Some of the world's biggest companies now hold resources greater than the economies of entire countries. With that level of financial strength comes something even more significant: leverage. But how does this power actually work? It begins with economic dependence. Governments rely on corporations for job creation, investment, and economic growth. Large companies employ millions of people, contribute heavily to national revenue, and play a central role in maintaining economic stability. Because of this, governments must carefully balance their policies. Decisions that could harm major corporations can also risk economic disruption, job losses, market instability, and reduced investment. So even without direct control, corporations become a constant factor in decision-making. Policies are shaped, not just for public benefit, but also to maintain corporate confidence. Another major channel of influence is political financing. Elections in the United States are extremely expensive. Campaigns require massive funding for advertising, media, outreach, and public engagement. A significant portion of this funding comes from wealthy donors, corporate-backed groups, and political action committees. This creates a system where financial support translates into access to decision-makers, access to policy discussions, access to influence long before laws are even written. And while this process operates within legal boundaries, it creates an imbalance where those with greater financial resources have a stronger voice in shaping the system. Then there is lobbying, one of the most direct forms of corporate influence. Corporations employ professional lobbyists whose job is to represent their interests in Washington. These individuals meet with lawmakers, present data, suggest policy frameworks, and ensure that corporate perspectives are always part of the conversation. Many of these lobbyists are former government officials. They understand the system from the inside. They know how decisions are made, who holds influence, and how to navigate the political landscape effectively. This makes their impact even more powerful. But corporate influence does not stop at politics. It extends into the structure of everyday life. Corporations control key industries: technology, energy, healthcare, finance. These sectors define how people communicate, how they access information, how they receive medical care, and how they participate in the economy. Technology. Companies, for example, manage the platforms where billions of people interact daily. They shape the flow of information, influence public conversations, and indirectly affect how opinions are formed. Financial institutions influence interest rates, credit systems, and global markets, determining the conditions under which economies grow or decline. Healthcare corporations impact the cost and availability of medical services, shaping one of the most essential aspects of human life. When all of these elements come together, a pattern begins to emerge. Corporations are not just participants in the system, they are architects of it. Supporters argue that this power is necessary, that corporations drive innovation, create jobs, and push society forward. Without them, modern infrastructure, technology, and economic development would not exist at the scale we see today. But critics raise a different concern. When profit becomes the primary goal, public interest can sometimes take a secondary position. Decisions may prioritize financial gain over environmental protection, worker welfare, or long-term sustainability. This creates a constant tension, a balance between economic growth and social responsibility, a balance that is not always maintained. Another critical factor is globalization. Modern corporations operate across borders. Their decisions are not limited to one country. This gives them influence that extends beyond national governments, making them some of the most powerful entities in the world. In many cases, governments find themselves negotiating with corporations. Rather than controlling them, policies become compromises, decisions become shared outcomes, and power becomes distributed across networks instead of centralized in institutions. So we return to the central question: if corporations can influence policy, shape economies, and impact global decisions, where does real power truly exist? Is it in elected offices or in corporate boardrooms? The answer is not simple, because in modern America, power is not held by one group alone. It exists in a network where corporate influence and political authority are deeply connected. And as we continue to explore this system, we arrive at another powerful force, one that does not just influence decisions, but shapes what people believe to be true: the media. In a system where power depends on influence, controlling information becomes just as important as controlling decisions. Because in the modern world, people don't just respond to reality. They respond to what they believe reality is, and that belief is shaped by media. In theory, media exists to inform the public, to present facts, hold power accountable, and give people the information they need to make informed decisions. But in practice, the role of media is far more complex, because media is not just a source of information, it is also a business. And like any business, it depends on revenue, audience attention, and financial sustainability. This creates a fundamental tension. On one side, media is expected to deliver truth. On the other, it must attract viewers, generate engagement, and compete for attention in a crowded information landscape. And in this competition, not all information is treated equally. Stories that create emotion, conflict, and urgency tend to receive more attention. Headlines are designed to capture interest. Narratives are simplified to maintain engagement. Over time, this shapes how events are presented and how they are understood. But there is another layer to this system: ownership. A large portion of major media outlets are owned by powerful corporations. This does not automatically mean that all content is controlled or manipulated, but it does introduce a potential influence. Because when media organizations are connected to larger corporate structures, their priorities can align with broader financial and strategic interests. This influence is not always direct. It does not require someone to issue orders or control every headline. It works through selection. What stories are covered? What stories are ignored? How events are framed? Which voices are amplified and which are not? This is how perception is shaped, not by forcing people to believe something, but by guiding what they see and how they interpret it. Another powerful aspect of modern media is repetition. When the same narrative is repeated across multiple platforms, it begins to feel like consensus. And when something feels widely accepted, it becomes more difficult to question. This creates what many experts describe as a perception reality, a version of reality that is constructed through consistent messaging. And in this environment, controlling the narrative can be just as powerful as controlling policy. But media influence has evolved even further. With the rise of digital platforms, information now spreads faster than ever before. Social media, online news, and algorithm-driven content have transformed how people consume information. Now, instead of a few centralized sources, there are millions of voices competing for attention. At first glance, this appears to increase freedom, more voices, more perspectives, more access. But it also introduces a new challenge: algorithms. Modern platforms use algorithms to decide what content people see. These systems are designed to maximize engagement, showing users content that is most likely to keep them watching, clicking, and sharing. This creates an environment where emotionally charged, polarizing, or sensational content is often prioritized, not necessarily because it is more accurate, but because it is more engaging. And over time, this can shape not only what people see, but how they think. Different groups may be exposed to completely different versions of reality, each reinforced by the content they consume. This leads to division, confusion, and competing narratives. And in such an environment, truth becomes harder to define, because perception itself becomes fragmented. So the question is no longer just, what is happening? The question becomes, what are people being shown? And perhaps more importantly, what are they not being shown? Because in a system where information is filtered, selected, and amplified, silence can be just as powerful as speech. What is not reported can matter as much as what is. And this brings us back to power. If you can shape perception, you can influence belief. If you can influence belief, you can influence behavior. And if you can influence behavior, you can influence outcomes. This is why media is often considered one of the most powerful forces in modern society. Not because it controls everything, but because it shapes how everything is understood. And as we move forward, we begin to explore another critical part of this system, one that connects power, profit, and global conflict: The military-industrial complex. In every powerful nation, the military plays a central role in shaping both national security and global influence. But in modern America, the military is not just a defense system. It is part of something much larger, a network of relationships between the armed forces, defense contractors, political institutions, and economic interests. This system is often referred to as the military-industrial complex, a term first made widely known by President Dwight D. Eisenhower, who warned that this growing connection between military power and industry could have long-term consequences for democracy. At its core, the military-industrial complex is about interdependence. Governments rely on private companies to produce weapons, technology, and defense systems. These companies rely on government contracts for revenue, and both depend on continued investment in defense. This creates a cycle, a system where military spending becomes not just a matter of security, but also of economic importance. The United States has one of the largest defense budgets in the world. Billions, even trillions, of dollars are allocated over time to maintain military strength, develop new technologies, and support global operations. This funding supports jobs, drives innovation, and fuels entire industries. But it also creates incentives, because when so much economic activity depends on defense spending, reducing that spending becomes more complicated. Decisions are no longer just about strategy, they are also about economic impact. Defense contractors play a major role in this system. These are private companies that design, build, and supply military equipment, from aircraft and ships to advanced weapon systems and cybersecurity infrastructure. They operate as businesses. Their goal is to grow, to secure contracts, and to remain competitive. And to do that, they must maintain strong relationships with policymakers. This is where influence begins to take shape. Defense companies engage in lobbying, political contributions, and strategic partnerships to ensure that their interests are represented in decision-making processes. They provide expertise, technology, and solutions, making themselves essential to national security. And in doing so, they become deeply integrated into the system. Another important factor is long-term planning. Military projects are often developed over many years, sometimes decades. Once a program begins, it creates jobs, infrastructure, and financial commitments that are difficult to reverse. Canceling such programs can have wide-ranging consequences, affecting local economies, employment, and political support. This creates momentum, a system that continues to move forward, even when the original strategic need may evolve or change. Then there is the global dimension. The United States maintains a significant military presence around the world. Bases, alliances, and operations across multiple regions. This global reach requires continuous support, logistics, equipment, and coordination. And again, this support is often provided through partnerships with private industry. But the most complex aspect of this system is its connection to conflict. Wars and military operations require resources. They increase demand for equipment, services, and technological advancement. This does not mean that conflicts are created intentionally for profit, but it does mean that when conflicts occur, they activate a system that is already in place, a system that benefits from increased activity. And this raises an important question. When economic interests, political decisions, and military strategies become interconnected, can decisions remain purely focused on security, or do other factors begin to influence the outcome? Supporters of the system argue that it ensures readiness, innovation, and national strength. They point to technological advancements, defense capabilities, and global stability. Critics, however, warn of a different risk, that the normalization of high military spending and continuous global presence can lead to a system where conflict becomes more sustainable than peace. Not because it is desired, but because it is embedded within the structure. This is the complexity of the military-industrial complex. It is not a single entity. It is a network, a system where government, industry, and military priorities intersect, and where decisions are shaped by a combination of security needs, economic interests, and long-term strategy. So once again, we return to the central question. Where does real power exist? Is it in the decisions of elected leaders, or in the systems that influence those decisions? Because when power is distributed across networks, it becomes harder to define, and even harder to control. And as we move toward the final chapters of this story, we begin to explore one last critical layer: the system that holds everything together. The illusion of control. In every system of power, there is one element that determines its strength more than anything else. Because power does not only depend on control, it depends on belief. If people believe they are free, they behave differently than if they believe they are controlled. And, in modern systems, this belief becomes one of the most powerful tools of all. In the United States, citizens are given rights, choices, and the ability to participate in the political process. Elections, free speech, and public debate all create the appearance of control, and these elements are real. But the question is not whether they exist. The question is how much they influence the final outcome. Because participation does not always equal control. Voting gives people a voice, but influence depends on how that voice interacts with the larger system. And as we have seen, that system includes corporations, media, political funding, and long-standing institutional structures, all of which shape decisions long before they reach the public. This creates a situation where individuals feel empowered, but the direction of the system remains largely consistent. This is what some analysts describe as the illusion of control. Not because people have no power, but because their power operates within defined boundaries. Think about it this way: system can allow choice, while still limiting outcomes. It can offer multiple options. That all lead to similar results. And when this happens, people feel like they are deciding the future. Even when the overall direction remains unchanged, this does not require manipulation in the traditional sense. It works through structure, through design, through the way options are presented and decisions are framed. Another important factor is distraction. Modern life is filled with constant information, entertainment, and activity. News cycles move quickly. Social media demands attention. New trends, new stories, new conflicts appear every day. This creates a continuous flow of information, but very little time for deep reflection. And in such an environment, it becomes difficult to step back and question the system as a whole. Attention is always moving. Focus is always shifting. And when attention is fragmented, understanding becomes limited. This is not necessarily intentional, but it is a natural outcome of a high-speed information environment. At the same time, emotional narratives play a powerful role. Stories are framed in ways that create strong reactions: fear, anger, pride, or hope. These emotions drive engagement. They shape opinions, and they often simplify complex issues into clear, easy-to-understand positions. But reality is rarely simple, and when complex systems are reduced to simple narratives, important details can be lost. This further reinforces perception over understanding. Then there is identity. People connect with ideas, groups, and beliefs that reflect who they are. Political identity, cultural identity, social identity all influence how individuals interpret information. And once identity becomes involved, perspectives become stronger, more fixed, and harder to change. This creates division. Different groups see the same events in completely different ways, each convinced that their perspective is correct, and in this environment, consensus becomes difficult. But from a system perspective, division has an effect. Because when people are focused on opposing each other, they are less focused on questioning the structure itself. This is how the illusion of control is maintained, not through force, but through perception, structure, and constant engagement. People participate. They react. They debate. They choose sides. But the underlying system continues to operate in a consistent direction. So does this mean people have no power? No, people do have power. Collective action, awareness, and critical thinking can influence change. History has shown that movements can shift systems, but that change requires awareness. It requires the ability to see beyond the surface, to question not just what is happening, but how and why it is happening. Because once perception is understood, the system becomes clearer. And when the system becomes clear, the illusion begins to fade. And this brings us to the final part of our journey, where everything comes together. Where we attempt to answer the question we started with: who really controls the system, and what does that mean for the future? At the beginning of this journey, we asked a simple question: who really controls the system? Now, after exploring government structures, corporate influence, media dynamics, military power, and the illusion of control? The answer is no longer simple. Because power, in modern America, is not held by a single person, institution, or group. It exists within a network, a system of interconnected forces, where government, corporations, media, and military structures all influence one another. No single entity has absolute control. But together, they create a structure that is powerful, stable, and incredibly difficult to change. This is not a system built on obvious control. It is built on balance, a balance between influence, interests, and long-term stability. And within this balance, decisions are shaped, not always by one force, but by the interaction of many. This is why change often feels slow, why different leaders can produce similar outcomes, why policies evolve, but the system itself remains consistent, because the system is designed to sustain itself, to adapt without collapsing, to adjust without losing control, and in doing so, it maintains continuity. But this raises an important question. If no single group controls everything, does that mean no one is responsible? Or does it mean responsibility is shared across the system? The truth is, this structure reflects both power and limitation. It allows for stability, but it also creates resistance to change. It enables growth, but it can also preserve inequality. It protects interests, but it can also limit transformation. And, within this complexity, the role of the individual becomes more important than ever. Because while systems shape outcomes, people shape systems. Awareness is the first step. Understanding how power works allows individuals to move beyond surface-level perception, to see connections, to recognize influence, to question narratives, and to think critically about the world around them. The second step is engagement, not just participation, but informed participation, asking better questions, seeking deeper understanding, looking beyond headlines and simplified explanations. And the third step is perspective, recognizing that systems are not fixed. They evolve over time. History has shown that change is possible. Movements can reshape policies, ideas can shift societies, and awareness can transform direction. But change does not happen automatically. It requires effort, it requires clarity, and most importantly, it requires people who are willing to look beyond what is presented and understand what is actually happening. So, is the United States truly free? Or is it a carefully structured system of control? The answer lies somewhere in between. It is a system of freedom, operating within a structure of influence, a system where people have a voice, but where that voice exists within a larger network of power. And understanding that balance is the key, because once you understand how the system works, you no longer see it the same way again. You begin to recognize patterns, you begin to question assumptions, and most importantly, you begin to think for yourself, and maybe that is where real power truly begins.